Hello. This is Julia Wahl in her podcast, How to Live. And today I have the pleasure of being in conversation with Kirsten McEwan. And Kirsten is a research psychologist with over 18 or maybe even 20 years of experience in developing, evaluating health and well-being treatments. She is involved in research to do with CFT, so compassion focused therapy, and based on what I'm reading from one of the websites, you are happiest spending time in nature, and you are trying to bring together your passion for the outdoors and health and well-being research. You are a forest bathing practitioner and researcher working closely with the Forest Bathing Institute in the UK, and you've been therefore involved in many forest bathing ecotherapy projects, such as the project called Park Bathe. And your research interests involve green social prescribing, of course, forest bathing, compassion-based interventions, and sustainable urban landscapes. Is that all correct, Kirsten? And should we know anything about you, anything else we should know about you or your research interest? And welcome.
I don't think so. I think that captures it pretty well. Yeah, I've been working as a researcher for the past 20 years, and I started by working closely with Professor Paul Gilbert, the founder and creator of compassion focused therapy. So I spent a lot of my early research career really building the evidence base for compassion therapy as an intervention. And it's kind of in the last 8 years really that I sort of moved away to Wales, and I don't know if any of your listeners have been there, but it's a place where it's really easy to get out into nature. You've got sort of the coast and the mountains, and I ended up doing a lot of conservation volunteering there, and I got so addicted to nature and spending time on islands with seabirds that I actually started to apply to do a master's in ecology and to retrain as an ecologist. And then I had an opportunity through a grant application to bring together my passion for mental health interventions and spending time in nature. So I thought, okay, I'll do that for a few years, then I'll become an ecologist. But then I discovered more opportunities for researching how nature can benefit our mental health. And I've just kind of continued along that research path more recently, but combining it with bits of compassionate mind training as well.
So how do you combine these two areas, Kirsten? So compassion and nature-based research interventions?
Well, I suppose there's two angles to it, really. There's the sort of human well-being perspective. So, taking compassion practices outdoors and doing them in nature it can have an added bonus, really, in that there's a lot of therapists taking their interventions, whatever they may be, outdoors into nature, because there's quite a bit of research evidence to suggest that when we're in nature, we can just focus and concentrate our attention better and absorb information more easily. I mean, it's part of the reason that we have things like forest school, and that being in nature has this kind of attention and stress recovery components. So it's helpful to take your therapeutic practice outdoors for those reasons, so clients can just feel more relaxed already and hopefully absorb information better. But also it's kind of taking away some of that therapist-client hierarchy, because if you walk into your therapist's office, there's an immediate, you're walking into their territory, and there's an obvious hierarchy there, whereas a few therapists, like Mary Jane Rust, has written a book about her experience of taking practice outdoors, and said that, part of the benefit of being outdoors is that it's nobody's territory. So you're kind of on more of an equal footing and you lose a bit of that hierarchy. And also if you have a patient who struggles with, social anxiety or making eye contact because you're often walking side by side. There's not so much reliance on direct eye contact, so that can be a bit easier for patients as well, or particularly if somebody's experiencing trauma. And she also said that nature becomes a kind of co-worker really to the therapist, that there are lots of metaphors that can be found in nature about resilience, like the tree that's been battered in a storm and you can see it's damaged, but it's still sending out fresh green leaves. She said that often her patients spontaneously came up with these metaphors of nature and kind of comparing themselves, saying like that tree's had a hard life and so have I, but it still looks really majestic and is thriving. So it sort of opens that possibility for them as well.
So how do you practice compassion in nature?
Well, I first sort of had the idea that this could be helpful because compassion-focused therapy, one of its major aims is to get people more into their rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system. And that's something that practices like forest bathing have been shown to be effective at achieving as well. So when I first started looking at how nature can affect our physiology and how we feel in our bodies, I found loads of evidence for this intervention called forest bathing. And it's basically a slow, mindful walk in nature where you really pay attention to your surroundings using your senses. And most of the evidence for this intervention comes from Japan and South Korea, and they found that it can really increase what's known as our heart rate variability. So it's an indicator of how much we're able to get into that rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system. And as someone who's looked at heart rate variability as an outcome measure for compassion-focused therapy, I thought this was really impressive that after just 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever duration the study included, but you could improve people's heart rate variability very significantly with this thing called forest bathing. So I felt like there was an underpinning goal there that both are trying to get you into your rest and digest and parasympathetic, and also both have this sort of mindfulness component and embodiment practices. And also because compassion-focused therapy is really rooted in evolutionary psychology and attachment theory, a lot of the examples that are used in its trainings come from nature, like when Paul talks about, how the zebra that escapes attack from the lion has a little shake, shakes off the stress and then goes back to eating grass. Whereas as far as we know, as humans, we're fairly unique in that we can replay a threatening incident like that, and we can imagine all of the worst possible consequences, like imagining ourselves slowly being eaten to death by the lion and what's going to happen to my children. And, we can imagine this and kind of keep that threat going over a longer period. So examples like that Paul uses from nature, I felt like there was a lot of scope to bring those kind of learnings and metaphors from nature that we have in compassion-focused therapy and sort of apply them in a forest bathing setting and let the patients kind of come up with their own spontaneous interpretations and learnings from nature about what it is to, move on from a threatening experience, for example. Or an example I use as well is that Paul often talks about the lottery of life and how none of us chose where we grew up or who our parents were or what we look like or how our bodies function. And it's all a bit of a genetic and environmental lottery, and we're just all doing the best we can. And often I talk in forest bathing about how a tree will put out millions and millions of seeds over its lifetime. And statistically, it's likely that only one of those seeds in its whole lifetime will actually grow to a full-sized tree. And the seeds are landing in really non-ideal growing conditions, and they're just having to do the best that they can with the growing conditions they've been given. They might land somewhere where it's just too dry, or they're in the shade of other trees, or it's too rocky. So it's kind of those sort of metaphors that make us have a sort of larger context and a larger picture of our place in the world, and help us give a sense of perspective. I thought those metaphors could come out of nature directly as well.
So what, because you have referred to forest bathing, and my next question is about what constitutes forest bathing intervention, because I find these days that almost anything tends to be called forest bathing, any type of, me just walking into the woods. And we, as both practitioners and researchers, know that that simply isn't true. So what do we exactly mean by it? What does this intervention entail, Kirsten?
It's a good question, because I was listening to some colleagues who've just come back from Japan, from trying forest bathing there, and they said that in Japan it's quite a different model, that because of their cultural history of things like Shintoism and Buddhism and those animist philosophies, they've really grown up with the idea that trees, rocks, mountains, rivers, they all have, they're all animists, that they all have a spirit, all their ancestors live there. So they're really used to having this kind of respect and reverence for nature and walking quietly through nature. So a lot of the time, forest bathing in Japan, where it originated from, is a self-guided walk. And you can have the option to go on a multi-day retreat into a real large wilderness area with a guide. And that's apparently quite an expensive thing to do, that only a few, privileged people can afford. But yeah, it's quite a different model in that most of it is self-guided. But here in the UK, we don't have that cultural background. And I think we're really suffering at the moment from a disconnection to nature. And that's also what the kind of research evidence is showing us. So there've been a couple of studies that have looked at nature connection and biodiversity across, 25 plus countries. And very sadly, the UK is in the bottom 3 for nature connection and biodiversity. So the fact that we don't have much biodiversity or, variety of wildlife to interact with, and we have so little tree cover, we only have 13% in the UK. In Japan, they have 70. Means that there aren't many opportunities for us to interact with nature on a day-to-day basis. We're living in increasingly urbanized grey areas. And so I think there's this real disconnect from nature. And as a result, there's also a lot of skepticism around things like forest bathing and green social prescribing, where people are saying, why would a walk in nature help my well-being? I need proper medical treatment for what I'm experiencing at the moment. Why would nature help? So I think in the UK, forest bathing looks very different. It's very much a guided walk. And the organisation I trained with, the Forest Bathing Institute in Surrey, they place a large emphasis on mindfulness as part of the forest bathing practice as well. So you train as a forest bathing guide, but also a mindfulness practitioner. And what we're trying to do is prompt people through all of the senses to really, really pay close attention to their environment. And we're trying to shut down those opportunities for rumination and your mind wandering back to, your to-do list and all those emails you have to respond to at work. So we use a lot of prompts to help keep people on track. So, for example, I'd start a walk by explaining where forest bathing originates from, that it comes from Japan, and it was introduced by their government to deal with work-based stress, but also too much screen time, and that it can really benefit our physical health and well-being in a variety of ways. And then we'll take a really slow walk in. The walk is in silence so that we can pay full attention to our surroundings. And I'll start with visual activities because that's the one most people seem comfortable with. So we'll notice maybe the different shades of green that we can see in the woodland, then noticing other colours. We might start to notice different signs of what season we're in, noticing movement amongst the tree branches or the sort of flight of insects or movement of birds. So lots and lots of visual activities, and we often pause to study a scene in detail, just looking into the foreground, middle distance, further out. So it's lots of visual activity to begin with. Then I usually create an opportunity for people to share the nice things they've noticed, because although we've walked in silence, if you've just seen something really cool, like a squirrel doing something ridiculous, you want to tell everybody about it. So we often pause and just have a moment to share anything nice that we noticed. And then I usually move on to listening, because that's another sense people are more comfortable with. So I'll often talk about how our sense of hearing and our sense of smell are quite subdued in urban environments, because we're often bombarded with a lot of noise and strong smells, like, cleaning products and deodorants. And also we don't have any predators in the UK, so we don't really need a good sense of hearing or smell to detect those kind of threats. But a lot of species that do live in woodland, like mice and deer, they have these large dish-like ears that they can move around to capture noise. And luckily we can imitate that. So if we cup our ears forwards, we can listen in front. If we cup them upwards, we can listen to the sound in the tree canopy. Or if we cup them downwards, we can maybe listen to our own footsteps through the mud or the leaves. So it's just showing people these little tricks to really amplify each sense and to try and detect more. So we just spend some time listening to sound. And apparently natural sounds are one of the most important ingredients in a forest bathing walk as well. So I just recently did some research with the Forest Therapy Hub across 21 countries, and we found that was the sense that people associated the most with well-being, that opportunity to just pause and listen to things like birdsong and running water. Then we move on to smell. So we do a couple of exercises to open up the airways, and then we do things like tear up leaf litter and smell the leaves, and smelling soil. And then touch. So we'll use our fingertips to notice the textures of bark and moss, or how different leaves feel. And then usually in the last 10 minutes, I invite people to either spend time with a tree or admiring a view. But often at that point, I'll bring in a bit of the sort of compassion element. So I might do a mindfulness activity and either giving compassion to oneself or receiving it from others, mental imagery, just to end the session, so that everybody's hopefully by that time feeling really relaxed. But yeah, it's a lot of guidance, because I think if you don't prompt people, it's too easy to, your mind to wander and to go off the way it does with traditional mindfulness.
Is it important where we do it? Because I know that some both researchers and practitioners emphasize the importance of, for instance, having certain, being in contact with certain types of trees. So a certain type of environment would be advised to be surrounded. We should go to certain environments, certain ascribed places.
Yeah, that's certainly true, that there are recommendations about where to do it. And I know as a guide, my life is a lot easier if I'm in a very biodiverse, mixed habitat, ancient woodland, with that experience of seclusion where you don't have lots of other walkers coming past. Because one thing about doing these activities, you can imagine we're in a group in the woods and we've got our ears pushed forwards like this. People feel self-conscious. So what you want is an area where you can just step off the path and get away from other walkers, so that you're not feeling so self-conscious and overlooked. But yeah, the advice from Japan, and I'd say a lot of the advice in the UK, is that really you want natural, semi-ancient or ancient woodland, because there will be lots more biodiversity, a good mix of habitats. We know from research that the more biodiversity there is, the better the well-being benefits we can gain. But also there are certain types of tree, as you say, that are more beneficial for us. So, for example, coniferous trees like cedar and pine and cypress, they give out these, I'm going to call them wood essential oils. The scientific term is natural volatile organic compounds, but they're part of the tree's immune system. So when they're being under attack from maybe an infection or an insect infestation, they put out these wood essential oils, and that's part of their immune system. And it has this strangely complementary effect on our immune system. So when we breathe in these chemicals, we get an immune boost. And it actually led to the Japanese coming up with a recommendation of dose for time spent in nature, which is 2 hours a month, because they did a study where they got some Japanese businessmen to agree to being locked in a windowless hotel room for 24 hours, and they pumped in a very expensive woodland perfume made up of these chemicals. And they looked at their blood before and after and found that anti-cancer protein activity increased by around 50%, and that this effect lasted for a month. So that led to the recommendation that you should try to spend time in mixed evergreen and deciduous woodland for 2 hours each month to get this immune boost. And a lot of that research has been done in Japan, where they've, gone into the forest and set up equipment to detect these chemicals. And then they've been able to show that if people walk there, you get a similar effect in people's blood profiles and immune response. But I recently collaborated with the University of Sheffield, and we took the equipment out into my local woods where I run every day in Sheffield, called Ecclesall Woods. And we did find a large variety of these wood essential oils in that ancient woodland. But when they took the same equipment back to a manicured garden in the city centre, we hardly found any of these wood essential oils. So really they're uniquely found where you've got a mix of evergreen and deciduous, and particularly strong in cedar and pine. And the best is to get out in nature and breathe them in, but you can also bring it into the home to some degree. So I have a diffuser by my bed, and every night I have half an hour of just diffusing either pine or cedar oil around the room to try and relax. So yeah, I think ancient woodland and a mix of habitats is ideal, but that's a luxury that we don't all have access to. So there's been quite a lot of research on mapping green space around the world, and what the researchers have found is there's a lot more access to this high quality green space in the wealthy neighborhoods, and there's not very much in the low income neighborhoods. So I have tried forest bathing in parks, and I do lead most of my walks in city parks, and it's still incredibly effective. I get really good research outcomes from doing that. So in the work I did in London city parks, we found like a 40% reduction in anxiety, 50% reduction in rumination. And we also got a significant, I think it was like a 12% increase in heart rate variability. So urban environments work as well. The dream is like the ancient woodland, but you can do this in a park, and you can even do it in your own garden or with a view out of your window if you're struggling to get out.
So is there a particular group of people, and by that I mean clinical populations, that would benefit, that we know that would benefit based on the research that, for example, you're conducting? So what would be the populations that would benefit the most? What are the recommendations? What does the knowledge tell us?
So most of the research coming out of Japan and South Korea recommends that forest bathing is best suited to people who are struggling with cardiovascular health issues, or high blood pressure, or low blood pressure as well, because what forest bathing tends to do is regulate or bring us a better balance. So there's plenty of research to show that it lowers blood pressure, for example, but there was one study that showed that even if you start forest bathing with low blood pressure, it can actually raise it. So there's something about being in the forest that gives us a good balance. So it's primarily recommended for, blood pressure and cardiovascular. But I think I've seen research papers where it's been applied to populations who have COPD, diabetes, sleep complaints, pain. It's a growing area. There are more and more research studies coming out with these type of populations. I've done a little bit recently. So there's a organization in Canada called Eco Wisdom, and they are an organization who are led by people with chronic illness. So a lot of them have spinal cord injury or some kind of chronic fatigue illness. And they recognize that there aren't forest bathing opportunities for people with mobility impairments and low energy. So they created their own organization, and a lot of their stuff is delivered online. So it will be videos and photos that the guide provides, and then they use a lot of mindfulness techniques to really help people immerse themselves in that imagery. But their preference is to try and really, I suppose, work with the national parks and city parks to get better access for people with mobility impairment to trails so that they can do in-person outdoor forest bathing. But even online, we got some fantastic research results. So I think we looked at general symptoms of fatigue and pain and depression and anxiety, and overall they reduced by, I think it was about 30%. And also social connection improved as well, and rumination really improved. But it was the qualitative comments, the things people said about having a long-term illness and being able to access nature still through this virtual setting. They said it was, just such a gift and incredible, and really motivated them to try to also physically spend more time outdoors as well.
So you've mentioned the benefit of social connection. So how does that work? What do we know about this particular result, benefit of us being in nature?
Yeah, it's not something that's been researched traditionally. So usually with forest bathing research, they tend to look at the profile of mood states. So things like, anxiety, depression, anger, confusion, fatigue. Those are the typical outcome measures alongside heart rate variability and blood pressure. But more recently in my research, I've been including nature connection and social connection as outcome measures. And we generally find that social connection improves by about 30% in the general population. But if you take a population who are socially isolated, like, for example, I did a study of people with long COVID, so they're not leaving the home because they're either bedridden, fatigued, or fearful of reinfection. Their social connection went up by 81% after engaging in online forest bathing. And I think it's partly because, of course, you're doing it in a group, you're performing the same actions. So it's a bit like, going through a ritual together. We're all doing the same thing. We're all cupping our ears in the woods, looking a bit silly together. So I think it's partly that we're doing all the same activities in a group, but I think it's also that we're silent. So there's that opportunity to just be in quiet company. And then when we do talk, when we do share things, it's always really positively framed, because I'm asking, what are the nice things you noticed from that last activity we did? So there's no opportunity for anybody to start talking about climate change or what the government are doing, or, complaining about local politics. It's all very positively framed. And I think we're seeing each other at our very best. And we're sharing the things we noticed. Like, one person will say, oh, I noticed that tree was completely bare apart from one really bright yellow leaf. Or I found this lichen that smells like a church. Or so we're all sharing the nice things we've noticed in nature. And I've often had people join walks who say, I wouldn't ever normally want to be in nature with other people. It's normally a very private, solitary experience for me. But this has been lovely to hear about other people's observations and what they appreciate and are grateful for in nature. And I've had, when we did our first research study in Derbyshire, we had people, you know, hanging around afterwards, talking to each other, and then lift sharing back to the city together and saying to each other, you know, I feel like we came here as strangers, but now we're friends. And on one of my recent walks as well, I had a participant who got a little bit tearful at the end and was saying, I really feel like we've lost our connection, not just to nature, but to each other. You know, our ancestors would have lived as tribes. And today on this walk, I really felt part of a tribe and that everyone in this group is part of my tribe. And I feel very protective of everyone. So I think it's that we just have that nice, it's a very positive connection.
So is it really about being in nature, or rather, so let me be the devil's advocate here for a moment, or is it just that we are now spending time together and doing something separately and yet together? How important is the nature element in that experience, or is it that as some people are suggesting, being connected to something other than just myself? So let it be this other type of nature more than human nature. So, for instance, this forest that I'm now in. And then becomes this metaphor of being connected to other things, including other human beings, and maybe not only human beings. So, what do you think about that?
It's a very good question, and I wonder if we went just for a cup of tea together and had a chat, would we get similar outcomes to being in nature? It's not a bad idea for a control group for a study. I mean, in the first study I did, I compared forest bathing outdoors with compassionate mind training indoors. And we did create those similar sharing experiences that I've just described in the compassionate mind training condition. In terms of statistical significance, they were equivalent. You know, forest bathing and compassionate mind training were performed pretty much the same. But if you looked at the mean scores, we were getting slightly better results with the compassionate mind training. So yeah, I think it's an open question, but I would suggest that nature is a good facilitator because it gives you a common topic of reference to talk about. So often I start the walk, because we're all strangers, I'll start by saying, if you could we'll do a round of introductions. Everybody give me your name and tell me about your favourite place in nature. Could be a new place or one that you've loved for years. And that's just such a good icebreaker, because then we have usually about a 5-10 minute walk into where we're going to actually do the activity. And people start chatting, oh, so you really like this woodland, I've been there as well. Or, oh, that sounds like a great place that you're describing, I'd really like to go there. And you start to hear these conversations already beginning. So I think you've just provided people with, not just through the conversation, but through the environment itself, you're providing people with a common topic of conversation, but a really positive one as well. So I have been on a forest bathing walk led by another organisation, and they didn't do it in silence. They let people just talk as they walked. And I did notice that sadly, what a lot of people's conversation tends to drift towards is politics and how dissatisfied they are with the government. So on this walk, I thought, this is such a shame, that we're walking in nature, but we're not looking at it. We're not taking it in because these people are, talking about how terrible the government are. And that's really triggering this other person who I can see doesn't want to talk about that. So I think forest bathing is an incredibly safe social environment because there is no room to start talking about potentially triggering topics. The focus is very much on positive and the beauty of nature. And we might get the odd comment when I say, share the nice things you've noticed, and somebody might say, well, I found it really hard actually to switch off from how much litter there is in the park today, and that's really upset me. But that's about as negative as it ever gets. So yeah, I think part of the kind of magic of that social interaction is shared activity, and just that it's such a positive framing.
So let me ask you this broad question. So how do you see the future of psychotherapy that embraces or incorporates nature-based interventions or paradigms, philosophies, including CFT? So, for instance, if we were to look at CFT, how these two approaches, paradigms, so compassion, namely CFT, and nature-based interventions could be combined. How would you like to see them be combined and developed?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the moment, I integrate elements of compassionate mind training into my walks. But I would love to do that more. So often what you get is people come along to one walk, and then often, and I hear this from a lot of other guides as well, you're lucky if they'll come back one more time. So what you want is really to have a program of walks where people come to at least 6, if not 12 walks, where you can start to really weave more of the compassionate mind training material in, and just progressively cover more each walk. But if I'm doing it, say I've got a new group of walkers, I'll usually start by giving an introduction to what forest bathing is, but then I will talk about Paul Gilbert's 3-circle model of affect, and how we all spend way too much time in our fight and flight system, how they might have already experienced that on the way to the walk, just battling through the traffic to get there and finding a parking place and worrying about being late, and how we can often keep the threat that we're experiencing going longer by replaying the event and ruminating about it. Like the argument you had with your partner a few days ago, you might keep that threat going by replaying it. And how also we're under pressure in society to constantly be productive and busy. It's like a competition for who's busiest. And that sort of drive competitive system and the fight flight, they're both underpinned by the same physiology, by the sympathetic nervous system. And we're spending far too much of our time there. And what we're neglecting is our rest and digest parasympathetic. So with the forest bathing, it's not that we're trying to get rid of our fight-flight system, because it's got a defensive function that's really served us well and kept us alive. But it's more that we're using the techniques of, mindfulness and forest bathing to help us transition more quickly and easily from our fight and flight system into that rest and digest when we need to. So I'll always start with the 3-circle model. And what I've started to do as well, particularly with the groups of children I take out, is I'll ask them to vote about how they feel. So I'll say, if you're feeling relaxed, bring me a leaf or a feather. If you're feeling excited, bring me a stick. If you're feeling a bit worried about something at the moment, bring me a stone. But it has to be small enough that you can hide it in your hand. Nobody can see how you're voting. And I hold out a bag and close my eyes, and they all put things in the bag. And then I lay them out on a piece of paper where I've drawn the 3 circles. And at the end of the series of walks, we revisit these images. So I take photographs of before and after. And often what you get before is a couple of people will have picked up stones to say that they're worried. We might have 1 or 2 people who feel relaxed, and then a few who feel excited. But usually by the end of the walk, nobody's feeling worried. There are no stones on the picture. It's all lots and lots of leaves to show feeling relaxed, and maybe 1 or 2 sticks from people who feel excited. I've started to do it with students and adults as well, and they quite enjoy it. But it's a good way to visually show in the photos of this image, look, this is how you all felt at the start of the walk. This is where you are now. You've all moved a lot more out of your fight and flight into your rest and digest. So we know that spending time in nature doing these things can really benefit our well-being. And it's giving them homework as well, horrible word, but yeah, just giving them activities to bring nature into their daily life. So I usually share an email at the end advising about the stuff you can do to bring nature more into the home, or how you could find a sit spot in your own garden and just observe the same scene every day and see how it changes over the seasons, that kind of thing. And then usually, towards the end of the forest bathing session, I'll do a mindful appreciation of where we are, a little bit like the safe space imagery that's used in compassion focused therapy. And then we'll usually transition into a, either receiving compassion from yourself or from other people. But being able to build upon that week on week, and maybe introducing more of those metaphors that are used in CFT, like the zebra that escapes the lion, or the sort of genetic lottery of life, and just comparing that to, what's happening in the forest with the trees. I think the more we can weave it in over time, the more it's like a drip feeding of the sort of psychoeducation and practice of CFT, but taken outdoors. Or you could make it even more explicitly, CFT or CMT focused, and just literally hire a place at an outdoor centre in some woods and sit there and do your therapy with your client in nature. And maybe, use have some of the mindfulness activity focused on their immediate surroundings in the therapy session. Or you could
sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, or you could, I know that one of the practices is to embody compassion by taking on the body posture and the walk, walking as if you were a compassionate person, walking through nature in that way maybe as well.
So how did this all happen for you? And by this, I mean both compassion and this nature-based interventions. Your interest in these topics. What does it mean in your life, Kirsten? If you don't mind me asking that question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I first learned about compassion. I was, I just come out of university, and I was looking for work, and by a very happy coincidence, ended up working with Paul as a research psychologist. That was my first real research job outside of university, and Paul had just really started his very early work on compassion focused therapy. He just published that first paper, the really famous Gilbert and Proctor paper. So, I started researching compassion and helping to build that evidence base, and was just really passionate about it because I could see, from interviewing the patients who'd received this intervention, I could really see how it had benefited them, and how it was very different from what was currently available, really. So I was very, very passionate about trying to build that evidence base and help more patients get access to it as a therapy, and just sort of growing its reputation internationally as well, so that just really as many people as possible could access it. And then I ended up moving away to Wales and working in clinical trials for a while. And as I said, I think, as a child, I was really connected to nature. I had quite a challenging childhood because my mother had really severe postnatal depression. So I spent a lot of time in nature. I was out dawn till dusk. And I'd also had this special conifer tree that if things ever got too upsetting, I would just climb up into this tree and spend hours hiding there. And I remember tearing the leaves and the conifer cone seeds and just smelling them, and that being really soothing. And I was talking to my sister recently, and I hadn't known this, but she also used to run away to a willow tree in our park when things were bad. So we both had our own trees that we went to. yeah, I had this real love and connection to nature. It was always somewhere that I felt incredibly safe and welcome. But then you kind of get into like studying and academia and work, and I very much lost my connection for many years, trying to do a part-time PhD and a full-time job. I didn't have time for anything. So it was only when I finished the PhD and moved to Wales and nature was on my doorstep that I was really able to reconnect with it. And just all the volunteering I did in conservation and going out to seabird colonies where you're in the species minority for a change. There's only 10 humans on the island and then tens of thousands of seabirds, and if you're lucky, some dolphins and seals. So it just really made me feel like, yes, this is what I need for my well-being, and I want to just spend as much time in nature as possible. So really, I was looking for a way to redirect my career more towards like ecology or ecology research, or, how spending time in nature might benefit our well-being. And then I got a grant application, which was successful, to do a project called Improving Wellbeing Through Urban Nature. So it was all about noticing nature in urban areas on your doorstep. And we had an app, which is still available. It's called Go Jauntly. And there's a section in there called Nature Notes, which you can use, but it prompts you once a day to notice the good things in nature. And we found that significantly improved people's well-being. And we also looked at people who'd been referred through their GP practice, and it had a clinical significance as well, that it was really improving people's well-being. Just this brief gratitude intervention based on Seligman's work, really, of just noticing one or two things that are good in your urban environment about nature. And then that contract ended, and I intended to go back and be an ecologist, but other opportunities came up. So I worked on a meta-analysis with a colleague, and we were looking at how nature affects our physiology. And by far the most evidence was coming out of this thing called forest bathing that I'd never heard of. And in our meta-analysis, we reported 20 papers in forest bathing that increased people's heart rate variability. So I thought there's really something to this. And I'm impressed by any intervention that can alter our heart rate variability. So I thought this is something worth looking at, and it's not been researched in the UK. I found only one other paper in the UK, whereas most of the research has happened in Japan and South Korea. So I started phoning around different forest bathing guides and organizations saying, would you like to work with me? We could get some evidence for your intervention. And it was then that I got introduced to the Forest Bathing Institute in Surrey, and they're really passionate about trying to make forest bathing available through the NHS and on social prescription. So we did that first project together, and they actually took our data back to their local council, and it did become available on social prescription in Surrey following that research. So I'm just trying to, build the evidence base for it in the UK and in lots of different populations as well, because I'm having done work with Eco Wisdom in Canada. I'm pretty passionate about bringing nature connection experiences to people who can't necessarily physically get out into nature as well.
I was also thinking that people who might not have the same luxury of living close to nature or even parks. So what would you recommend to these kind of people, that could still be of benefit in terms of nature? Are there any other types of interventions, even if you live in a place, well, it's a desert island in terms of not nature being available, let's call it.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, if you've really got like nothing, if there's not even a good quality local park, particularly where you feel safe, because that's another barrier. If you're in a low income area, often on a map you can see, oh, but there's a park there that you could access. But then you ask people about it and they say, yeah, but there's loads of antisocial behaviour and litter. I don't want to go there. So I think it can be challenging, but, you know, with our longer COVID study, for our participants who felt they had the energy and mobility, they could practice in their own garden and just find a sit spot and do a lot of the activity in their own garden. And the other option was the sort of for those who, you know, really didn't have the mobility or energy to do it online using the images and pictures. So I think, you know, virtual is always an option. And it's been shown in research to be of similar effectiveness to doing in-person forest bathing. But I would say the beauty of nature is that it is everywhere, even if it's one street tree or, you know, one dandelion growing out of the crack in a pavement. And there are certain species as well where it's easier to have interactions with them. Like, you know, anywhere you go, there will be birds and some insects. So I think it's just tuning into what's available, and it could be that you try to pick or just notice the greenery on your commute to work or school. Like just, noticing those tiny little cues of nature, like the fallen leaves on the path or the hedgerow that you're passing, or if you notice a particular street tree that you pass every day and just spend some time noticing how it changes over the season. There'll always be something, even if it's the tiniest little bit of nature to connect with, or even if it's just in your own garden. So yeah, there are always opportunities, and I think the more you can bring it to something that's on your doorstep, the more feasible it is to practice, right? So it's, for me to go out into my nearest national park is half an hour in the car. Not too bad, really. But if I'm on a busy work day, like today, I've got lots of meetings, probably the most nature connection I'm going to get is sitting out in my garden and just noticing all the new flowers that have come out, how the foliage in my trees have changed, seeing what insects are in the garden flying around the wildflowers at the moment, or just looking up into the sky and noticing any birds that I can see there, any trees I can see on the horizon, or even just the shape of the clouds. You know, a lot of people get a lot of connection to nature and a feeling of expansiveness just from looking at the sky. So even if there's no visible nature around you because you're in a really urban area, just connecting to the sky in the daytime and then the night sky as well. So I've actually got a research colleague at Derby who's looking at nature connection at night as well, and looking at how we connect to the night sky and how we notice the stars and the moon. So I think there's always something, even if it's just one slither of nature, that we can try and tune into.
So my very last question, Kirsten, is how to live according to Kirsten McEwan.
Oh gosh, that's a lot of pressure. I mean, for me, I bookend my day with nature. I make sure that I get out for a run in my favourite woods every morning. I spend at least an hour there, and during my run, something will capture my attention. It might be a particular tree, or I might come across a crop of mushrooms or some flowers that have just come into bloom. Something grabs me and makes me stop on my run, and I might pause there for 5 minutes. There's a particular tree I really love, and I often end up lying underneath it for 10 minutes in the middle of my run. And then at the end of my day, to kind of signal to myself that work is over now, it's time to relax, I'll just go for a walk in the woods over the road from my house, just as a way to just sort of settle down and shut off from work responsibilities. But I think getting out into nature at least once a day, even if it's only for 20 minutes, could be the minimum target. But yeah, I like bookending my day in that way. And I think as well, if I'm if I'm really busy and stressed at work and I need a break, even just pausing and looking out the window like I am now, I could notice the movement of the tree canopy, or I could look up at the crazy alien spaceship shapes the clouds have made in the sky today and just appreciate those. It's just taking your attention away from the screen right in front of you and putting it out into the distance. And bringing nature into the home as well. So I've got a diffuser by the bed that I use to smell pine and cedar oil for half an hour before bedtime. But I also bring natural objects into the home. So I don't know if you can see, I've got a little egret feather on my desk.
How lovely.
Which is very precious. They're very rare to find. And woodpecker feathers. I've got some stones here and a bit of wood that looks like part of somebody's spine. So I'm always bringing, seasonal pieces of nature back into the home and having them on my desk or on my dining table, so that if I'm wanting to just have that moment of switching off, I can pick up and handle these natural objects in the home. And the display on the table changes with the seasons, so that's really nice as well. So yeah, just bringing more nature into the home and just making sure you do either get out, even if it's only into your own garden, just once a day for at least 20 minutes to get that benefit of being out there, and go on a forest bathing walk. There are so many guides internationally now, giving it a go at least once to see what it's like and to get some more ideas about how to connect with nature better.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for a lovely and inspiring conversation, and good luck with your research. I'm sure I'm not the only one who'd like to learn more about it. So thank you so much. Have a good day and a good life.
Thank you.